So my name is John Gould. Um, so over the past few years, I've been working under the guidance of Colin on the bell frog population on Kooragang Island. So a lot of my work is monitoring the population ecology, population dynamics, that type of stuff. But on the side, I always try to, explore other avenues. So when you do a lot of field work, you do tend to see a lot of observations. It's one of the luxuries of being in the field so often. So this presentation, I'll just go through some of the observations that I've found in the field over the past few years. I probably had too many in here, so we'll see how many we get through, and then we'll just stop at some point. Hopefully this will be like a bit of a conversation, so maybe with each observation, if anyone had questions, they could just ask as we go along. Maybe that's probably the best way to do it. So natural history, probably a dying art when it comes to science, or maybe it's never been a really strong art, but potentially a really important thing that we all scientists should be doing in the field is taking natural history observations and trying to publish them if they can. And there's a few reasons why it's really important. I think as a researcher, it's really important because it gives you a chance to write and to improve your skills and your observation skills. Kind of over time, you get better and better at it. In terms of science research, it's really important because it gives you a better understanding of the ecological niche of your target species. So it kind of gives you a better sense of the resource needs of your species, the interactions with other species in the food web, also the resources it requires. And so these things become really important over time when it comes to building up a management strategy for a species. And it could potentially increase the chance of success and the outcomes of that management. And finally, it's also really good for public engagement. So I think a lot of these natural history observations the public find really interesting. So they do tend to be picked up as news stories, which gets people excited about the environment, and maybe it helps people gain that relationship with the environment, which is really, really beneficial. So yeah, to begin with, the frog on the left is a bell frog, and it is partially blue, but you can't really see it that well. So that's why there's that little bubble in the center. Okay. So these slides are going to be really image focused. So not a lot of dot points or anything. I thought that would be the best way to do it, just to break it down and give you the observation, and then we can discuss it and explore it. So one of the first observations that I found when I was doing my PhD in the Watergans on Lake sledge ride was this poor green tree frog that was literally stuck to a branch. So it wasn't able to hop away when I came close to it. And when I tried to lift it, I couldn't budge it from the twig. And so I thought, bizarre. At first I thought that it might have been sap from the eucalypt branch that it was on. But then quite obviously in the right-hand corner, you can see a red triangle slug. So what's happened here is that the red triangle slug has secreted an adhesive mucus, and the green tree frog has become covered in it. So it's technically superglued it to the branch. Probably like a rare off chance that this occurs in the wild. It probably doesn't occur very often. So the benefit of this is more so in terms of like the creation of biological adhesives, more so than it is for frog conservation. But it kind of shows you that the interactions in the environment, frogs interact with all types of species. Literally anything that it can fit into its mouth, it's going to try to eat. And so at times when it tries to eat a slug, well, this can be the outcome. And these types of stories have gotten quite a bit of attention in the news. So the public engagement for this type of science research is quite high compared to really long technical scientific publications, which are definitely probably more important in terms of the outcomes, but probably don't get the same amount of public engagement. So it's a bit of, a balance between the two. Okay, next observation. So on Kooragang Island, I just tend to take photos of mosquitoes, and I'll tell you the reason why later. Um, but at some point, I noticed that all of these mosquitoes were extracting blood from the nostrils of these different frogs. So this is three different species of frog. You got Latoriophallix, Latorioperini, and the bell frog. And you can see that the mosquito is extracting blood almost in the exact same position. Just one mosquito drawing blood from either left or right nostril, which is quite a strange behavior to observe. It's such a niche thing to see, and there's no variability. So they're not extracting blood from different regions of the frog's body. And sometimes you can see the mosquito land on the back of the frog and then walk its way up to the head to find the nostril to extract the blood. And I guess there might be a few reasons for that. It could be because the capillaries are closer to the surface of the skin, or the density of the capillaries. Or it could just be that it's a natural hole in the skin, the nostril, so it's probably easier access to the blood. So this is a native mosquito. I forget the name of it. There's like 20 species on Kooragang. And yeah, it just loves to suck on frog nostrils. So it is a quirky natural history observation, and a lot of these behavioural notes are published in ecology, which is a really good journal to publish notes in, because it gives you a chance to really describe what you found, compared to other ones like Herp Review, where you just provide the statement and you don't get to provide a discussion for what you think is happening or the importance. So it could just be seen as a trivial thing, but really when you connect it to proper research, it might become really important. So a few years ago, we came up with the idea that mosquitoes might be a vector of the chytrid fungus. So we had agar plates, and we had mosquitoes, and we tried to see if they could pick up the chytrid and transfer it to another agar plate. We found that it could, and I'm pretty sure last year another research group did the same thing, but they might have done it with live frogs, which is much better. So something that can be seen as quite trivial becomes quite important when you connect it to disease and fungus and the ways that these species interact, which is quite interesting. Okay, hopefully this video works. It's a really, really crappy video. But I think this is the first natural history observation that I made when I was doing honours. I won't say what's going to happen, and let's see if you can pick it up, because it is quite subtle, but I thought it was really fascinating. Did anyone see what happened? Yeah, so it was hunting mosquito larvae. So that's a Lecreatus flexuri tadpole, and this is a really small ephemeral pool that has no nutrients in it. It probably has, the only nutrient source are going to be mosquito larvae and other lecky flecky tadpoles or eggs. I think when I first started to do research on amphibians, I always thought of tadpoles as being quite mindless and only feeding on algae, quite delicate and vulnerable. But then when you see these types of observations, it really changes the way that you view earlier life stages. They're not so fragile and vulnerable. They're hunters, they're predators, just like a lot of other animals and later life stages. And you can really see it. It snaps back when it sees the mosquito larvae pop up, and then it grabs it in its mouth. And so it really is just like a tiger in this ephemeral pond. So it really just changed the way I viewed tadpoles forever, really. So again, kind of trivial, kind of not. I guess it shows you those types of trophic interactions. So instead of just feeding on algae, detritus, tadpoles probably are one order up, and they do hunt lower order species. Yeah, and this is quite well known in other frog species around the world, but still kind of interesting. So the most recent observation that me and Colin had last year on Kooragang Island was finding nearly completely blue Latoria phallax. There are a few splotches of green, but pretty much it's entirely blue, which is quite a rare thing to find in the wild. You rarely see blue frogs. They do pop up every now and then, and I think there was a green tree frog from the north that was on Australian Geographic. Quite jealous of that. So this is called a xanthism, and the cause is really interesting because people assume that frogs are coloured primarily just due to pigments. So everyone knows melanin as a pigment. That's a pigment that we have. That's what colours our hair and our skin. And frogs do have melanin, and they have another pigment that's yellow. But the blues and greens that are expressed by frogs, that's a structural colour. So it's akin to the colour you see in butterfly wings, which, again, I had no idea until I started to dive deep into this. But people assume that it's a green pigment, but it's not. And it's not a blue pigment either. You can't really see too well here, but this is showing the three pigment layers of the frog skin. So at the base is the melanin pigment, and then at the top is the yellow pigment. Then in between is this cell called the iridophore, and it's a light-reflecting cell. So it contains all of these crystal plates, purine platelets, almost like mirrors that are stacked. And it's the very specific way that these mirrors are stacked that gives rise to structural coloration. So dependent upon the thickness of those layers and their composition, certain wavelengths of light will be reflected and expressed, while others will be cancelled out. So if you were to change these platelets and make them thicker, the frog might express red skin, which it doesn't. But in other species, such as fish, there's more of that variability. So yeah, all of the blues and the greens, mostly in frogs, that's a structural colour, not a pigment-based colour. But it does depend upon the other pigments being present. So without the melanin layer, instead of expressing a blue colour, frogs will express a white colour, which is what you see on their vent. They're, that really brilliant white ventral skin. That's purely the iridophore, the light-reflecting platelets that are scattering light, causing that diffuse kind of appearance, almost like a cloud. But then if you underlie it with melanin, it becomes blue through a lot of different processes going on at the same time. And then if you overlay it with the yellow pigment, it's only the green that is expressed. So it does become quite complex. And these observations are really important, I think, because sometimes it is an indicator of issues in the population. So it's really important to kind of determine the rate of these mutations and these deficits in a colour expression. Because if there's a change, you might be able to see that there's something going on in the population, such as if there's a crash, if there's inbreeding, even if there's pollution in the environment, sometimes that can strip the pigment from the frog skin. So yeah, it's something that people don't report often. And there are other mutations, so we often find yellow bell frogs, and that's caused by a different issue with their pigment. That's when the melanin is no longer present, and so what is being expressed is just the yellow pigment. I always try to make a cool title when I publish these notes. I don't know if Colin enjoys that.
No, I like it.
I think it just makes it, people understand straight away what you're talking about. But you can get carried away, which is a big issue. Okay. Can anyone tell me what they're seeing here? Yeah, eating eggs. So I think this is the first observation in the field I had of a lecky flecky tadpole that had consumed the eggs of a conspecific that had laid later on in the same pond. So again, the tadpoles, they hunt mosquitoes, and they also consume their own kin. So they're quite, little vicious little things. And For a species that uses ephemeral water bodies, this becomes a really important behaviour because because these ponds lack nutrients, because they're so ephemeral, there's no extensive food chain that develops. Sometimes the best nutrient source is each other, which becomes a really big threat if you're a female about to lay her eggs, whether there are conspecifics already present that have hatched. And so we did a study later on, and we tried to see whether females were avoiding ponds that had eggs already, tadpoles already present. And yeah, they definitely avoid ponds that already have tadpoles, which makes sense because if that's your key predator in this environment, you want to do your best to make sure your offspring don't become prey. Conversely, you want to make sure that your offspring do become predators. So you want to lay next to other egg clutches of tadpoles that haven't hatched, because it gives your tadpoles a chance to then cannibalize other tadpoles. So it's a bit of a game of chase, and it's all about the timing of when you deposit your eggs in the environment. That's really important. So this is the froth nest of the sandpaper frog. And as you can see, starting from the most simple, on the left is just one egg clutch. So one clutch laid by one female and one male partner. And you can see that as you go to the right, that these big masses become quite big. So these are communal masses of egg clutches that have been laid by separate adult male pairs. And the one on the right, I think that was like 20 or 30 individual clutches laid side by side. And so they form these beautiful rafts that float on the surface of the water. And when you think about the tadpoles being predators of conspecific eggs, there might be a benefit of laying communally to protect your eggs against being preyed upon by other tadpoles. So as you increase the volume relative to the surface area, you decrease the total number of eggs per clutch that are going to be exposed at any one time. And so it might be a cooperative behaviour that is protecting each clutch from being predated upon by conspecific tadpoles. And again, just published as a natural research article in ecology. Ecology is like the best natural history, behaviour journal to publish in. The funny thing about Lecky Flaky froth nests is that over time, as the embryos are developing, the froth nest breaks down. So you can see that on the left, the froth, the clutch, the egg mass has little bubbles in it, which is why it's so white. But over time, those bubbles dissipate, and the nest starts to expand over the surface of the water, which makes a lot of sense because as the eggs develop, they require more oxygen. So they can extract the oxygen from the froth nest, but over time, they need more sources of oxygen. And so by increasing the surface area, it reduces that oxygen competition. But on the flip side, it makes them more vulnerable to things like predation. On the other flip side, if you expand the nest over a larger surface area, it gives each embryo a close contact with the water. So when they do hatch, they hatch directly into the water compared to hatching into the froth nest itself and becoming trapped, which I think might be a really big issue. On the right, that's the front hand of a adult female. And you can see that one of the fingers is really flattened like a spoon. And so to produce the froth nest, she will literally scrape at the air, the surface of the water, and she will then carry the bubbles under her body into the growing egg mass. So that's how they create their froth nest. This is Lecky Flaky again. So what's happened here is that the froth nests have been laid in a pond, but the pond has dried so quickly that the embryos are left stranded on land pretty much. But as you can see, particularly in the left, that all of those embryos are still viable, they're still alive, and they're still developing. So there's this idea that the froth nests can also protect the embryos from desiccation in cases where the pond has entirely dried. So it kind of gives them, it's like a survival life raft, so that they can survive until there's additional rain that's likely to occur in a system that's highly variable. And so it allows them to remain viable until there's future rain where they return to being surrounded by water, and hopefully they hatch in water again. But if not, then there's going to be total clutch failure, which is a really big issue for Lecky Flecky. There's a high chance of total clutch failure because of the pond ephemerality. They breed in like puddles that are really tiny, the smallest puddles you can imagine. Any questions so far? Okay. So these are the embryos of a Phalaria species. This is something that Mike Marnie discovered in the field. He discovered that the embryos were hatching in the froth nest, and they were consuming their siblings that had yet to hatch or develop. So this species is, I guess, really important because they create their froth nests in separated burrows that are separated from water. So they're protected from a lot of aquatic predators, but it does mean that there's not a lot of natural food resources available in those burrows. So you can imagine that if there is an unhatched sibling, that's going to be your the highest nutrient source available. But also maybe it's beneficial in terms of disease transmission. So if you have a halted embryo that's not going to develop, it's likely to start to decay. And I guess there is an issue of disease transmission in such close confines. So you can imagine that eating a sibling becomes really beneficial for yourself because it prevents the spread of disease, particularly fungus. But again, tadpoles are these huge predators that, maybe it's just me, but I always thought that they weren't so ferocious. Okay. Anyone tell me what this is showing? Have a good think. These are all taken on iPhone, so it's pretty crappy images.
They're embryos. That's kind of a broken down necklace. Mm-hmm. In a burrow.
Yeah. Yabby burrow. Yeah. That's what we suspected. So on Kooragang, just monitoring a pond that had partially dried up, we noticed that there were these burrows with, they're likely some type of limno, probably striped marsh frog, which are really common on Kooragang Island. But there's also the spotted marsh frog, and I guess they become really hard to differentiate until later stages once they've already netted. But we're pretty sure it was limno parani. So yeah, either the frogs, which tend to call underneath things, maybe the male was calling from the burrow, which then caused the female to come towards the male and for them to deposit their eggs in the crayfish burrow, which I think must be the case. I don't think it was the case that the eggs were laid on the surface of the water body and then the pond had dried and all the eggs happened to fall into this really small burrow. So it kind of shows you another interaction between two species you wouldn't expect to really interact, except you would assume crayfish probably do predate on amphibians. And I think there was an image recently of a blue crayfish that was eating a green tree frog. So yeah, I think the most fascinating thing here is that the burrow is not natural, so the burrow is made by the crayfish. So it's a frog utilizing a burrow created by a crayfish that wasn't naturally present in the environment. So it kind of does show you some really complex interactions between different species. And this could be really beneficial for the tadpole. So even if the pond has dried, the burrow is likely to retain water for longer because there's less surface area exposed and it's deeper. So there's less desiccation, evaporation. On the flip side, there are chances that Gambusia could use these burrows. So even if a pond has dried and you think that it's clear of Gambusia, they could be hiding subterraneously in these crayfish burrows for a long period of time. And unless you go and detect every burrow present in a pond, which is impossible, it means that a pond, when it has fully dried, there's still a risk that Gambusia will still be present. So yeah, kind of beneficial for tadpoles, but also negative in terms of Gambusia persistence in a drying pond. Okay. So, what's happening here? Actually, I think I've got a video. Cool. I think there's a happy ending at the end. Happy ending.
It was going to contribute to the next generation, but just in a different way.
Exactly. So although these are only like single, observations, which I guess a lot of people frown upon, which I totally understand. Sometimes they're just really rare observations, but they're still important because they could mean something that if other people kind of see and observe, it builds upon something. So that was an adult female bell frog that was trying to consume an adult male bell frog. And you can kind of tell that it's a female and it's a male. You can tell obviously it's a male because it has the black nuptial pads. For the female, you can kind of tell because, well, the size for one thing, the females are larger, as with most amphibians. But also, during the mating season, the adult males tend to become more yellow. So you can kind of see the dorsal pattern, how it doesn't have the same hue as the female. It almost looks more yellowy. And also there's a yellowing of the throat. So males tend to have a yellow throat while females have a brilliant white throat. So I guess we came up with the suggestion that this could be a form of sexual cannibalism, which is probably most well known for insects. And it happens usually after the male and female have, reproduced. And so the male becomes almost like an energy investment for his own offspring. But really, sexual cannibalism can occur at any point during the breeding, the reproductive behaviour. So for frogs, it can occur before amplexus, it might occur after amplexus. But for females, it's probably really beneficial to be able to choose whether you're going to exploit a male as a breeding partner or as food. And the funny thing is that a lot of female frogs can detect the quality of a male based upon his call, even his size. And so the male frogs have no choice but to call to attract a female. But he kind of doesn't know whether he's going to attract his future wife or his future demise. And the female amphibian ear is tuned to detect the call of of the male. And so she's really hardwired to be able to find this type of prey, which is really, really interesting. So who knows whether this happens often in the environment or between species, but females tend to be larger than males in amphibians, so there's a high likelihood that this might be occurring often in the environment. And it's kind of one of the key things that is required for sexual cannibalism, one sex to be larger than the other. But frogs are gape limited, so it really depends on the size difference between the males and the females. But I think for bell frogs, the males do tend to be quite small. They're around like 50 mils, while females are like 70 mils.
Yeah, the males mature quicker and smaller, so the big boys may be too big, but if she got one that had just matured,
Yeah,
could be a good male.
exactly.
Yeah.
So either those poor young males or those really just small inferior males are being eaten. And this is way off, and you can't really suggest this just yet, but I guess it's a form of natural selection that if females tend to be eating the smaller males, maybe it's doing something to the males in terms of their size. But also it's a huge threat for emerging male frogs that they obviously want to start reproducing as soon as possible. But there's a greater risk that if they do emerge and start calling once they've just reached adulthood, that they're going to fall prey to their females. And again, this got a lot of media attention, so the New York Times wrote something about this, which is really fascinating. I think it was at the same time that they wrote something about the black box, the Kitchener black boxes. So I'm surprised they ran with this story alongside the other, because that was like the biggest story of the year. But it just shows you that these kind of quirky natural history observations do get picked up quite a lot by the media. And if it gets people excited about the environment, if they gain a deeper respect for the environment and the complexities of these species they don't really think as being complex. I think a lot of people think that if it doesn't have fur, then it's not complex. It doesn't have these deep ingrained behaviours, all these fascinating interactions. These are Latorophallax that have typhus seeds attached to their bodies. The thing with typhus is that it's everywhere, but there's a chance that frogs could be a vector of plant seeds. Recently, there was a frog in Brazil that has been suggested to be the first vector pollinator of a flower. So the frog will actually go into the flower and move about and obtain the pollen on its skin. So I guess we kind of went along with that and said, well, there's a chance that frogs might be vectors of plant seeds. Which kind of makes sense because frogs have moist skin, surrounded in mucus. And these typhus seeds, they're evolved for wind dispersal. So they almost have these like feather-like appendages on the surface of the seed. And so they get picked up by frogs really easily. And you can tell the one on the right is just covered in, tens of seeds. But what's really fascinating is that it's not only seeds on the base of the frog. So you can imagine that the frog is moving through the environment and picks up the typhus seeds as it's walking. But they do tend to also occur on the back and almost like a backpack. And so there's probably a higher chance of those backpack seeds are being dispersed further distance than the ones on its vent, because as it's hopping, it's likely to be scraping against material, and those seeds are likely to be scraped off. But the ones in the back might be moved quite a long distance. But again, typhus is everywhere, it's in every pond, and so the importance of frogs as a typhus seed dispersal, I guess, is still up for grabs. But still, it shows their capacity, which is, the first hurdle, really. And again, this got picked up by Popular Science. So again, kind of quirky, kind of interesting, public engagement. Okay, so another bell frog image. I think people are getting sick of bell frogs these days. So these are adult bell frogs that are in a mangrove creek. And you can kind of tell that by the top left image, the pneumatophores of the mangrove tree. usually frogs and salt water don't mix really well. A little bit of salt water mixed really well for bell frogs because they might have a chytrid defense behind it. But full-on seawater, which is like 35 parts per thousand, is probably a no-go zone for a bell frog, even though it's adapted to persist in these coastal environments. So this is a really weird observation I made, I think it was 2 years ago now. And on Kooragang Island, during this breeding season, we found our largest breeding chorus in the mangrove creek compared to freshwater ponds that were nearby, that were full of fresh water, that would have been prime habitat, breeding habitat. But they had all moved into this creek line that typically is, high salt water. And so I guess we did salt measurements, and the salt water salinity was, I think, 1 to 2 parts per thousand, so a lot less than what it usually is. And so what's likely has happened is that, hopefully you guys can still hear me, freshwater lens has developed in the creek line, and so it effectively becomes an ephemeral pond, a freshwater body that the bell frog can exploit, which is really fascinating because typically on Kooragang Island you expect the mangrove creeks to be barriers for reproduction and also dispersal. But I guess during times after rainfall, when these freshwater lenses have formed, there's a chance that they could be exploited for breeding purposes. The issue is that if the freshwater doesn't last long enough and it becomes saltwater again, it becomes a breeding trap. So you can imagine that all the frogs have moved into this creek line to reproduce, but then there's every chance that it could become saltwater again before the tadpoles have had a chance to mate. And so all of those clutches have just been wasted, when they could have been safer to just exploit the typical freshwater ponds that were tens of meters nearby. So yeah, I think it's something that has to be researched more on Kooragang Island because a lot of the creek lines have been disturbed by drainage lines and roads, and they've almost split the creek lines off from the river system, which could mean that the freshwater lenses last for longer, and they're less likely to be flushed by high tide saltwater. And so maybe the artificial manipulation of those creek lines has benefited the bell frog a little bit on Kooragang Island. This is all just hearsay, but kind of interesting to think that we benefit these threatened species as much as we put them at risk. See if you can hear that. It's really a huge breeding chorus. This is the biggest one for this particular season. And you can kind of tell something's wrong with the creek line already because a lot of the mangroves in the center were dead. And I think mangroves don't survive well if there isn't enough salt water. It's one or the other. Even if it's too salty or not salty enough, mangroves have a really hard time. And again, just a fancy title just to make it less boring when people read these things. Okay. Does anyone know much about bell frogs and their love of trees? No? Well, it's usually thought that bell frogs don't like trees, full stop. Which I guess is a bit of an over-exaggeration that's been in the literature for quite some time. So much so that it's now policy to have no trees around ponds that are being developed for bell frogs. And that's more so to do with the effect of trees causing shading, which is really bad for the tadpoles in terms of their growth and development, but also chytrid, because chytrid likes really cold conditions. But on Kooragang Island, we find bell frogs in trees all the time. So these frogs are all, I think the first one is a she oak, and the next two images are bell frogs in acacias. I guess acacias are technically a bush, but they grow like a tree, and they grow quite tall, so kind of a tree. So these are not far off the ground. So you think, oh, this, might just happen because they have like a vantage point, they can reach, a low level tree. But really, we find bell frogs really high up in trees. So 10 plus meters. We found these, and I think the first one is like a eucalypt, an acacia, then a shea, something like that. So yeah, we do find them in trees. So probably an important finding in terms of policy when it comes to how you manage landscapes, terrestrial landscapes around ponds constructed for bell frogs. You want to make sure that there's trees available for the adults, but also that there's not too many trees so that there's too much water body shading, which is really bad for the tadpoles. But you can find a good balance. You can grow trees along some edges of a pond and not cause shading. So I guess there's a bit of nuance in terms of the ways that ponds are managed.
What's the reason, or what resource are they exploiting in the trees? What's the purpose of them being there?
I've done something. Sorry,
No, we've got this.
Is it because there's too many trees? They have to plant them?
Well, there's a lot of trees, but like we find them out there a lot. So, I mean, it could be foraging, insects are in trees a lot, obviously. During the daytime, this could be, like, we know they like to bask. Like, they do bask in the daytime. So it's a good basking point. They might just like going, they are a tree frog, technically.
Should the trains say shoot to the head?
Yeah. So, like, we always check the trees around every pond we go to because we will usually find a frog.
But I think that's the huge issue, is that people aren't checking trees because there's an assumption that they're not found there. So there's almost a bias against bell frog presence in trees. And we can only see trees within a 10 plus meter boundary around the pond. So who knows how much they're actually using trees in the greater landscape. I would still consider this natural history, but maybe this is verging into not natural history. But a lot of frogs have dorsal patterns that are really distinct, and it's so distinct that each individual has its own pattern that's unique, almost like a fingerprint. So these are the tympanum facial patterns, banding patterns of Lecreatus fletcheri. In the bottom is, the left is a male. Males tend to be yellow, and on the right is a female. They tend to be amber brown. And you can see there's really defined black banding patterns above the eardrum. And so we took photos of each adult frog that we found. And so when we did find a recapture over seasons and between seasons, we took photos and we compared to see whether the patterns were the same. And I think we got the public to match photos. And as it turns out, even members of the public are really good at matching bell frogs, lucky flecky, based upon their banding patterns. The top is just a stylized version of the banding patterns with all of the other information removed. And it kind of just shows you, it reminds you of like continents, and they're quite distinct. This might be really important because for some species, they don't retain their chips, artificial taggings, they don't retain them. I think little John is really bad for retaining pit tags. They tend to, I don't know if they absorb it and they excrete it, but they just don't stay. And also, I guess pit tagging is a bit of an invasive technique. You're creating a hole that then has to heal. It's better than toe clippings, but probably photographing ID is better in terms of being less invasive. The best way to do it would be to photograph the frogs without having to pick them up. But I think for the level of detail you want, you kind of need to pick them up still, particularly if you're just using an iPhone. If you have like an expensive camera gear, it might be possible. But the thing is, you want this technique to be available for the public to use. Under your guidance, obviously, you don't want people out in the public just grabbing frogs and taking photos, but the more people that can take photos, the better, and everyone has an iPhone or Samsung. And so what it means is that anyone can really participate in photo identifying frogs, at least partially. The big issue is whether these remain the same over time. So within the season, they're likely to retain the same dorsal patterns, but that might shift between seasons, and particularly between different life stages. So you can imagine a juvenile having quite a different pattern compared to its male form, just because it's had time to grow and develop. So that was with Lucky Flecky. Yes, this is when citizen science kind of comes into the forefront, which is quite a big thing these days, and I guess it will become an even bigger thing as time goes on. We did the same with bell frogs. So bell frogs have these beautiful dorsal patterns. On Kooragang Island, they tend to be splotches, stripes. I think other populations, they're a bit different. The ones in Broughton don't have a defined dorsal pattern edge between the green background pattern and the gold regions. But at least on Kooragang Island, the bell frogs, the adults, they do retain their dorsal pattern for quite a long time. So again, you can just use an iPhone, take a photo of a bell frog, put it away, come back, take another photo, and potentially ID the frog by just comparing images. This would be really good for populations that are really tiny, because as the number of frogs in the population increases, the number of matches, the combinations you have to compare just becomes too much. And that's when computer-assisted techniques become really important. Although they have issues themselves, and they still have to be fact-checked. You still need a human at the end a lot of times to match a smaller subset that the computer has provided you. So manual photo matching, I think, will probably remain quite an important technique into the future, even with AI and computer-assisted techniques. And the same thing for tadpoles. So bell frog tadpoles have these venation patterns in their tails. Other tadpoles have something similar. I think lip parani, they do, but not to the same extent. But the bell frog really have these defined veins in the translucent parts of their tails. And so we did an experiment where we raised tadpoles in the lab. We took photos again just with an iPhone. Kind of a hard thing to do with a tadpole because it's out of the water. It tends to be jumping about quite a bit. And the pattern is quite tiny. And so you have to be really, really still. And sometimes you can't get a really high quality image. But the areas in circle and white just show you the most distinct regions of venation for each of these tadpoles. So there's 3 tadpoles, 2 pictures taken at different time points, and it kind of shows you that the venation patterns stay the same for some period of time. So it'd be really interesting to test this in the field with a pond by taking photos of bell frog tadpoles and to see whether this would be a viable method to ID tadpoles, which is a really hard thing to do. There's not a lot of good techniques. You can't pig tag a tadpole with a microchip. You can use an elastomid dye, but they tend to be, they're not specific for individuals, they tend to be a clutch. So each color defines a different clutch. It becomes really hard to use an elastomid dye to ID, differentiate individual tadpoles, just because the combinations of different dyes, it just becomes too much and too stressful for a tadpole, because each dye color requires you to inject a different aspect of the tail. And it's quite a difficult technique using an elastomid dye to tag tadpoles. I think I would avoid it as much as possible. They don't do too well sometimes when you tag them. Okay, I think that's it.